Thank you very much, and goodness me, it's wonderful to speak in such a beautiful environment where I understand the treaty was signed that founded the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So how more historic and traditional could one be? I'd like to also thank Albert and thank Rick and thank the University of Utrecht for inviting me and this programme in particular. It's a great pleasure to be here. Okay, what I'd like to do is begin from very big principles and begin from very big ideas and large claims, and then gradually, I think, go to the particular elements of the big society. I believe we're in an epochal moment. We're in one of the structural shifts that defines civilization. And the scale of this, I think we've yet to grasp. We all, in some sense, have read too many issues of The Economist. We know Asia's rising. We, in some sense, appreciate there is a euro crisis, but it hasn't hit countries like the Netherlands yet, to the extent to which that crisis has hit Greece or Spain. And we know that there's been a structural shift, and we understand the collapse of Lehman Brothers was kind of important. But we don't really, I think, grasp, as one never really does when you're in it, quite what's happening. Now, I think this time is unique, and it's unique for the following reason. We have really, I struggle to think of another time when both of our dominant political ideologies have failed at the same time. And I think this marks where we are as genuinely historically unique. We're in a situation where the left has failed and the right has failed. And if you look at European history, generally speaking, from 1945 up to the early 70s, we had the ascendancy of a leftist, welfarist, entitlement type approach. After that, we had the victory first of Thatcher, then Reagan, and we had a neoliberal agenda that passed back into Europe. I can think of Schrödinger's reforms in Germany, Jospin's privatisation. And that really has been what's governed our world for, since the Second World War. But what I want to suggest to you is both now can no longer deliver. So let me be very concise. The left has failed, and the left has failed historically, because the left was founded to free the poor from poverty, to save the poor from their lot, and by any measure that they have failed to do. Therefore, what that means is all the policies that we've followed, almost from the time of Marx, about the idea of redistribution, welfarism and entitlement, we need to look at again. Because the percentage of public expenditure that the state has as a percentage of GDP has, until very recently, never been higher. And yet the inequalities that have been generated, the levels of relative disparity have never been higher. So something is profoundly wrong. And then if the left cannot save us from poverty, what is the point of the left? But by the same token, the right has also failed. The right claimed, and I'm sure you've read Hayek's Road to Serfdom, the right claimed that it would free us from centralised socialist state planning. It would free us in order to engender mass liberty, mass wealth. There would be multiple centres of ownership, entrepreneurship and innovation. A decentered vision of capitalism was extolled, where actually the penalty of centralisation and the concentration of capital would be tackled by free markets. They'd free capital. I agree with that vision, and I believe in free markets. But what's so remarkable is under the auspices of free market thinking, markets have never been so unfree. Under the idea of freeing us from serfdom, we have never been more enslaved. The right, under the guise of free markets, has produced the most massive concentration of wealth and power, mirroring the Edwardian or the Victorian era, to use British scales, in terms of the level of reward that has accrued to those at the top. So the right has failed to deliver mass prosperity. Indeed, what it's delivered, in my view, is mass servitude. And the rewards have only and increasingly gone to those at the top. So if that's where we are, if the right cannot deliver mass prosperity, and if the left cannot save us from poverty, where do we go? What do we do? Well, let me first sort of further talk about the errors of the left and the errors of the right, and why actually I believe they're not opposed ideologies, they're both the same. So let's go back to before Marx, by the way. Most left-wing thinking was civic, it was religious, and it was localist. After Marx, and Marx is the great disaster, the socialism became atheist, statist, and centralist. And it became this because it said, essentially, the concession it made when it passed into democratic politics is workers can never own. There can be no challenge to capitalism such that workers themselves become owners of capital. What there has to be is a state mechanism for permanent redistribution. And what we will use is we will use the state to challenge the concentration of capital, and through various distributive measures we will dispense to the poor levels of entitlement that they never would have otherwise enjoyed. And that was the fatal move. Because by that token, the poor were always and already going to be cut off from wealth and the origins of wealth. The true origin of all wealth is ownership. And once we had the welfare state set on the model that it was set on, ownership was effectively denied. Because what the welfare state was set on was distribution income. It was set on distributing income, not challenging assets and asset concentration. As a result, the concentration of wealth was allowed to grow, and gradually, via redistributive methods and taxation, people were given supplements to their income. Now, in some sense, that had remarkable achievements, and it really did establish various universal systems that really did produce benefits. But gradually and increasingly, and I won't go into the economics of it, what it produced was a complete collapse in productive ability. Workers demanded more and more for less and less, and as a result, the productivity, particularly in my country, in Britain, when we were the sick man of Europe in the 1960s, went through the floor. An effective investment strike by capital meant that nobody would invest to produce wealth. Now, what this meant is that in the end, claims that didn't lead to production and innovation essentially undermined the workers' settlement. And what it produced in its stead was a mass level of a capitalist response. And labour was viewed as unproductive, whereas capital was viewed that we had to set it free. Now, the freeing of capital has produced very interesting results. It hasn't produced, on the right, a mass distribution of ownership. Let me give you a quote. In 1974, the top 1% of US households had just under 9% of US GDP. In 2007, they had 23.5% of US GDP. What that means, and what the right has produced, is essentially what can only be called a rentier state. We've produced a settlement where the return to labour has been falling since the late 1960s. And if labour cannot benefit from work, what does that mean for those who rely on wages? Well, it means that they get poorer and poorer. And actually, if you compare unskilled labour in the US in the 1970s with unskilled labour in the US now, in the 1970s people were paid more. And that process has gradually climbed up the income deciles. So much so that middle-class people are now threatened by the forces that destroyed working-class people. And globalisation, which produced the deindustrialisation of much of the West, is now going to hit middle-class incomes, where much of the service-type work that many of you will go into will become standardised. We now, for instance, have a situation where robots in South Korea teach people English, and they have better results than human teachers. And what this produces then in our society is an endemic medium-term and long-term crisis. Because what it means is actually those at the top of society have captured wealth and innovation, and technological advance no longer percolates downwards. And every force that's operating in our society on the right claims to distribute power and profit, but what it does is concentrate power. If you think of competition law, which is meant to disrupt monopoly and challenge market share, the consumer welfare standard in international competition law is pro-monopoly. It aids market concentration. And what we have seen is the abandonment of the old European tradition of ordoliberalism that wanted the aim of competition law to be a pluralisation of ownership. Now back to the left. What the left are in a situation now with the welfare it creates is that welfare system doesn't just not help the poor, it actively harms them because it separates production from consumption. And the greatest error is that because it says there's a group of people who can never produce and will never produce and will never own, and they will always be subject to income supplementation. And when you do that to a whole group of people, what you do is you cut them off from any future whatsoever, and you maintain them in a state of permanent dependence. And when they try to move from welfare into work, the marginal tax rates that they face are so high, it's almost never worth working. And in addition, the welfare systems are so complex that when you move off welfare, often into low-paid work, that low-paid work, if you lose it, and most people will, because that's the nature of when you're at the bottom rungs of society, is it's very hard to get back on welfare, so people remain trapped. Now what I want to suggest to you is this, is these two forces are profoundly connected. If you create a capitalism that only works for the few, you create a need for mass welfare for the many. If you create a society where even people who work incredibly hard cannot get a standard of living that is secure, you create a society that cannot sustain itself. And indeed, if you look at the 1970s, what actually happened, in order for ordinary working families to get ahead, women had to enter the workforce. So if you calculate working hours per household, there's been a massive increase in labour hours worked per household. And yes, globalisation delivered a slight decrease in the price of consumer goods, but what really increased was debt. Massive, massive levels of debt were taken on by households because the states refused to carry on the debt function of stimulating the economy. And this debt function passed into individuals and to businesses. And of course, when the bubble burst, what happens is ordinary people are then trapped in a situation they can't escape from because they have massive debts. Wages will not produce a return to enable those debts to pay off, so they're rendered static. Now what I want to suggest to you is this left-right union, this left-right alliance is so pernicious that what it's doing is not just recreating class, it's recreating caste. And actually what we're seeing in the societies that have had a very strong state and then a very extreme market, like my country, is we see that Britain has one of the lowest rates of social mobility in the developed world. And in my country, a child age 7, who's the stupidest child, it's a horrible way of putting it, but is the least able child in a wealthy cohort, overtakes the most able child in a poor cohort by age 7. And the nature of modern life is advantage accrues upon advantage and combines again. So much so that by any measure, the type of inequalities that we now face rise and rise dramatically for those at the bottom. So that's the problem, and for me it's a serious problem. And in a way, what's actually gone on is even worse than that, because the real thing that's governing both left and right isn't socialism and isn't conservatism, it's liberalism. Liberalism is the dominant force in our society, and it's liberalism that is actively destroying the social infrastructure on one hand and the wealth infrastructure on the other. Because the left practices social liberalism. And social liberalism takes apart the family, takes apart any notion of permanence, and its whole aim is to reduce human beings to primary individuals who wish no permanent connection. So social liberalism, that sounds very progressive, very pro-women, very feminist, very liberating, is actually anti-women and anti-feminist because it takes apart the conditions for the securing of women, for example, through childbirth. When people and denies that men have any specific role or responsibility in regard of women. And this is great for middle-class people who can do what they want with whomever they want, but it's death for working-class people. And what we see in our society is the complete destruction of the social infrastructure of the poor. And a wish and a claim by the left that this is progressive, when actually what it does is leaves them isolated, alone, atomized, and the idea of community is just a kind of nostalgic myth. But by the same token, the right has followed economic liberalism. And economic liberalism, again, claims to reward the many, but only rewards those at the top. And those at the top it rewards to a level of excess that people cannot really grasp. Rates of CEO pay, rates of return. And it impoverishes and destroys the wealth and assets of property and the independence of people. And that's what I'd suggest to you is really what's going on in our society. And the mechanisms that the left use are exactly and in explicit harmony with the mechanisms that the right uses. And they do this unconsciously, and they know not what they do. But what they leave us with is a shattered society, one where only individuals are lauded. But if you create a society where only individuals can win, you create a society where the majority loses. Because a society that is fundamentally individualist is a society where the majority loses and the majority turn to welfare. And even then and now, there isn't even enough in the kitty to cover that. So that's the bleak story, that's the disturbing story. And all right, it's fairly bleak, but I think it's fairly accurate. Now, what I want to suggest to you is ways we can tackle that. And the big society, which I worked on with others, is part of a response to that. But normally when the big society is talked about, you never talk about the problems it's trying to address. And these are the problems. So let me start on the side of public expenditure, on the left side, if you will. And let's talk about what would be a big society or a new approach to welfare, to entitlement. Well, the thing I want to see is we spend billions and billions on the poor and they're still poor. Now, any kind of computation should tell us there's something profoundly wrong in this. That if anyone gave me those amounts of cash, I'd do very well on it. And this is because we've created a system that just funds income, not assets. So what I want to do is, instead of just giving people a little bit more so that they can get by, which, by the way, as more and more people can't get by, and as poverty reaches into the middle class, and therefore welfare reaches into the middle class, you create a society that's in real trouble. So just as capitalism is failing, welfarism increases. And if you look at the United States, for example, the proportion of the population in the United States that now needs welfare is well over 50%, whereas in the 60s it was less than a third. No society can survive this. So what can we do to change it? Well, I want to see asset, not income welfare. I want to see the expenditure that we put into communities create an asset effect. Now, we've already done this in Britain, where Mrs. Thatcher, at her most Catholic, followed an element of Catholic social teaching, where she gave away council houses at less than their value. And predominantly, and for the most part, the people who lived in those council houses were the poor. And the poor got a massive asset effect. And that was used to start businesses, to start education. It completely transformed the lives of those whose lives have never been transformed by left-wing policies and left-wing approaches. But the trouble is, it was a one-off and it was never done again. What I'm interested in is welfare as a permanent asset effect. Now, there's obvious ways we can do this. In Britain, if you are without a job, the state pays your rent. But in certain parts of our society, because poverty concentrates, there are some families who have had their rent paid for 30 years. There are some families who haven't worked for nigh on since the Second World War, and the state has effectively paid for their houses 3, 4, 5 times over. But neither the tenants nor the state has benefited. It's just the owners of those homes. So it's not beyond the wit of man or woman to create a situation where there's an asset return over time for both tenants and governments. And it's not beyond our abilities to say to people, well, one of the benefits if you move off welfare into work is we will give you an asset and equity stake. All of these things, I think, are important, and we can produce capital effects. What about child benefit, which is a benefit paid to mothers who have children? Why don't we give mothers the idea at pinch points that they can actually capitalise their welfare stream and have it as a one-off to precisely produce that? But that's all small beer. That is small ideas. Brilliant, I grant you, but nonetheless small. The really interesting thought is, what could we do with all the income that comes into areas? Now, government suffers from essentially just spending along departmental lines. So the police is a spending line, social work is a spending line, housing benefit is a spending line, medical care is a spending line, but they never talk to one another. So an area can have literally billions spent on it, and yet they're spent in ways that are often contradictory, work against one another, or aren't performed in any holistic way. Now, you will know from your own families and from your own upbringing, the only way you help human beings is if you help them in a holistic way. Just as in a good hospital, when you go in, most ill people have comorbidity, they have many problems, and the doctor looks at them all and says in the round, this is the causal factor, let's address this, and then we'll address everything else. So it is with human beings, but the state cannot do that. It seems incapable of doing that. So I thought, what about creating the conditions whereby areas themselves could come up as areas and take over the state and take over the public expenditure and group that public expenditure. So for the first time, they are able to pool all their resources and say, what's our most important factor? How can we address the holistic needs of the community? And the government, bless them, listened, and that became a community right, a right to challenge it's called, in the Localism Act that became law in Britain last year. Now, these rights, coupled with many other rights, are all about grouping income so we can create an asset, a pool of capital, that people then are free as a community to spend for themselves on the problems that they think are most urgent and most matter. And I think that has to be done in a hybrid way with the new model of the state. But basically, the very act of grouping all of that income will, I believe, produce an asset effect, produce something that's transformative. Also, the very act of grouping together solves the other social problems. The fact that the poorer you are, the lonelier you are. The lonelier you are, loneliness, by certain studies released, I think, last week, loneliness kills more people than cancer. And it's this that is killing our people and killing our communities and separating our families. But if people can come together as a community, then what we do is in order to spend real capital, is we also create social capital. So that's just some thoughts on the welfarist side. But let's flip to the right. What's the problem with the right? We don't have a market that works for the many. What we have, in fact, as I said earlier, is a rentier economy. We have a world where actually only big business succeeds. And in my country, 99.9% of all business are small and medium-sized enterprises. 78% of all British businesses are sole traders. But most markets are just dominated by 2 or 3 big players. And the barriers to market entry for small and medium-sized businesses are so vast they just can't break in. And in almost every field, retail, food retail, almost every mature market, the idea that a small business could get a share is simply utopic and laughable. But what I want to suggest to you is, in terms of the private sector, family-run businesses and small businesses are the only way the majority of us can benefit from capitalism. Because it's small businesses that give you ownership and create assets, and creates the condition for the majority to also prosper. The idea the majority can prosper through wages is over, it's dead, and it's not coming back. So we have to find another way for capitalism to benefit the many. Now, the trouble is, there was all these small businesses. They don't connect with one another, they don't talk with one another, they're not even in a position to succeed. So what do we do about it? Well, another part of the big society that's just become law in Britain is the Public Services Social Value Act. 2012, we had a lot in 2012, just become law on the 31st of January. This act says for all public procurements, that's for everything the government buys, which in Britain, by the way, is quite a lot, 220 billion in services every year. Now, all public procurement for services has to go through a pre-procurement phase where they ask what is the local social, economic and environmental benefit. Now, what this does is, in my view, one of the most transformative acts of Parliament that we've had in quite some time. This gives local commissioners of any public services, prisons, health, local authorities, this tells them they have to not just give businesses to the big outsourcing companies, because under New Labour, what happened is when things were privatised, and under Mrs Thatcher, all we did is we moved something from a public sector monopoly to a private sector monopoly. We didn't really break up the companies enough. We didn't really create a free competitive environment. But now for services, now that money, commissioners have the permission to give it to local businesses, to give it to small businesses. They're no longer subject to best value legislation, which says you do whatever is the cheapest. And if you do whatever is the cheapest, you give it to the big outsourcing companies. So now, for the first time, we have a truly transformative piece of legislation that could endow not just ordinary small and medium-sized businesses, but social businesses. And social businesses and social enterprises, in my view, can completely change the way in which we deliver public services. So let's bring these two strands together. Let me now talk about social enterprises and public services. Now, another idea that I had was that most of the people who are poor working in public services at the front line, and they're often women, and they're often de-skilled, and they're often just left to do one job for 20 years, so they become unemployable. And I thought, what if we created a situation in which those public services could spin out, i.e. could leave the state and become cooperatively owned businesses? That is, where everybody has a stake, where everybody is a shareholder, where we create, in essence, a form of workplace democracy, but actually thereby we endow people not just with assets from a business, but the ability to move and upskill their own talents within that business. I thought that would be a jolly good idea. And indeed, the government agreed and adopted it, and the level of mass mutualisation that's happening in the public sector now is unprecedented. But let me tell you why it works. In the early 2000s, in Sandwell, it's not a glamorous part of England, I doubt any of you would ever visit or notice if you did, but it's a council in the middle of the country, and it looked after adults and children in social care. This is very expensive. It's the most expensive and rising expense in any local authority budget. But they span out. They formed a mutual or a cooperative company. And then a social enterprise board came and did an audit, and it compared the price, because the council was still providing care for adults and children, with the price of the new community trust. And they found that the council, this is in 2009, the council was charging £658 per person per week for a bed. And it found that the new cooperative was charging £328 per person per week. And you sort of think, well, God, terrible things must have happened. The old were probably, fed terrible food, maybe other old people, their pensions must have been slashed, they probably brought in illegal immigrants, people were enslaved. That's the only way to explain that level of savings. That's nearly 50%, which everyone tells you can never do. So they went in and they asked, goodness me, how can you do it? And they found the following. People's wages hadn't fallen, actually they'd risen. People's pension entitlements hadn't been taken away, they'd all been maintained. But what had changed are the overheads and the culture. Sick days per year, that is the number of days that every employee took off because they were ill, in the council, was 22 days per year per employee. And that's not unusual. It fell to 0.3 days per year per employee in the new mutual organisation. The percentage of money spent on the front line, i.e. on services themselves, not on bureaucracy, rose from 62% to 83%. Not only that, patients were much happier and so were staff. Staff turnover dropped to almost nil. And that's the type of saving that can be engendered. Now, big society has often been accused of being something that is really a cover for cuts. What nonsense. What self-indulgent nonsense. What big society is a way of using public services to transform the life of the public, because the savings just in that organisation to go to more public services. It can go to education, it can go to grants, it can go to infrastructure. It can change the world if you produce multiples like that. Let me give you more examples. Just staying with the mutuals. Employee-owned companies in the United Kingdom outcompete on profitability alone the FTSE 100. Not just last year, but every year for the last 20 years by 10% every year. And during the crisis, it was 20%, or 23% to be exact. So what I want to suggest to you is the ideas that I'm talking about deliver explicit and transformative savings. But not only that, they also have multiple other goods. Because actually what they do is they recreate social capital. And they recreate relationships, and they recreate community, often in our most benighted and most destroyed areas. They put people together because they create an economic raison d'etre for them to do so, but they reward them for doing so. So we see in community energy, for example, a recent Res Publica paper that won an award, where we argued and showed that if you pull enough people together, just as consumers, you can use that purchasing power not to just purchase cheaper electricity, but to purchase the units of production themselves. So in Fintry in Scotland, with a wind turbine, the community said we'll all buy from one power source, and that enabled them to buy a wind turbine. That wind turbine paid for itself in 7 years, and thereafter and into perpetuity, or until it needs replacing, it will generate £500,000 a year for that village. Now, the point is that's replicable everywhere. You can do it with heat pumps, you can do it with solar PV, you can do it even with shale gas. So the point is these things are profoundly transformative, particularly along areas that cost the poor most. But I don't want to go on too much, because I probably am. I want you to leave you with one example. And this, I was in Liverpool, my hometown, last week. And I was going around with a company called the Alt Valley Community Trust. And they picked me up at the airport and they were driving me around. And what was noticeable is none of them were middle-class professionals. They were, and I hate this sort of language, so I don't believe in it anyway, but it's worth stating. They were genuine, bottom-up, working-class people restoring their own sense of community. And they drove me round two of the most violent and dangerous areas in Liverpool, which is Croxteth and Norris Green. And kids kill each other, and it's really horrific. And they took me around 3 council sports centres. They took me to one they were just about to buy. And it was disgusting, it was no investment was in it, it was failing, it was so dirty people didn't visit it. And they said, we're taking this over. And I said, well, crikey, how on earth can you do that? How can you make that work? Because they told me they don't do grants, they only do loan finance, which relies on having a sustainable budget line. Then they took me to one they'd recently done up. It was beautiful, shining, lots of new investment, everything was really compelling. And instead of just being for something for the working class, for the first time, the professionals from the doctors, from the local hospital were using it. It was making a lot of money. I said, how do you do that? They said, we can deliver these services for a third less than the local council, because their staffing structures are so archaic, and because nobody innovates and nobody creates a condition whereby they will act differently. We can do it for a third less and we still make a return. And we make such a high level of return that we can raise private sector capital to do them up and make them even more profitable. Well, blimey, that's good. So the community gets to keep a service, it gets a far better service at a third less of the cost. And what they also do is they then use the income from the professionals to supplement and ensure that people who live in the area but are on a fixed income can go in for virtually nothing. So I thought that's a win in itself, but it didn't stop there. They also said, oh, we're very concerned about food and the food that our people eat. So we bought a farm. Oh, that's quite courageous. And they said, oh, it's for 40 acres, but that wasn't enough, so we added another 100. We're now a 140-acre farm. And we produce vegetables for our own community, which we sell to them, and so on and so forth. I thought, this is just a bit peculiar. And they said, we got so upset with the level of failure to educate our children, who are often involved in dysfunctional activity, that we took over the skills provision for people in that area, and they now train young people. And I went in, they'd converted a church into a shopping mall. There was actually a training establishment that had fake hair salons and car repair shops done as if they were shops. And they trained people up. And they had some of the most successful employment statistics in terms of welfare to work than anyone in the country. And then they said, well, we're very upset because all our pubs are closing, so they bought a pub. I mean, so what you've got there is a not-for-profit outperforming the local state, being incredibly agile about the needs of the area, and actually whatever the needs of the community are, they create that, and they speak to that. It's completely transformative. Let me end on one last example that's to do with prisons. Now, ordinarily speaking, if you go into jail, it's kind of bad and you never escape. In Britain, if you go to jail and you're released, 66% of all those who are released are reconvicted in 2 years. Slightly higher for men, slightly lower for women. That is because the state cannot love you. And it also can't deal with the multiple problems you have when you come out of jail. But if you let groups take over the care of those prisoners, and particularly if they're faith groups, if they're faith-based institutions, the level of turnaround that people can get is extreme. And levels of reoffending and reconviction drop to below 20%. In some circumstances, it's 15%. And that changes the lives of everybody, not just the criminals themselves, but the communities and the society in which they operate in. So what I want to suggest, and I should end now, on this point, is actually it's only approaches like this that can tackle the long-term systemic trends that are operating against human interests. And until we can break the fetishization of both of our main traditions on the left and the right, with their dominant orthodox positions, we're not going to tackle the problems that we really face. So big society is just the beginning of the type of political and social settlement that we need. And given the challenges that we face, and given the long-term structures of capitalism, and given the way in which our society is creating more and more atomized people, in my view, this is the only way to go to preserve what can only be called civilization. Thank you very much.